Welcome to this conversation with Professor Shilpa Phadke from Mumbai. Thank you so much for being here today, Shilpa, and for accepting the invitation to hold this conversation in the framework of our digital conference, How to Live Together, Circulations, Practices, and Spaces in Indian Contexts.
Thank you so much. I'm really delighted to be here. And as you know, I have followed your work and I find this really a very exciting project. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. So in the next 30 minutes or so, we are going to talk about the idea that the practice of feminist loitering holds tremendous potential to radically alter, transform the ways bodies move, walk in the city, the way public space is shared, and it actually holds the potential to introduce very new ways of living together in rapidly globalizing cities of India and maybe even beyond that. So together with her two co-authors, Sameera and Shilpa Ranade, Shilpa Phadke published a widely discussed book. This is the book titled Why Loiter? Women and Risk on Mumbai Streets, and it was published in 2011. It is no exaggeration at all to say that this critically acclaimed book holds a very special place in many hearts and minds. And although we can perhaps say that the situation in India has become more repressive during the last decade, the book continues to be a major inspiration for many. It's highly relevant. It inspires lively discussions and seminars in already existing or emerging collectives. And as I observed, there's also an increasing number of feminist authors who write about their individual autobiographical experience of walking in the city and the pleasure of walking the city. So Why Loiter definitely hit a nerve, and many small scale and local movements grew out of the book or have been in conversation with the authors. Shilpa, can you first of all perhaps explain to us what feminist loitering means and why you see this huge transformative potential that feminist loitering might hold?
Thanks so much, Nadia, for that really very generous introduction to the book. When we began speaking about loitering and the idea of a feminist practice of loitering, it was tied very centrally and continues to be tied very centrally to ideas of citizenship and the sense that the city belongs to everybody. And there was really an engagement with the idea of a breakdown of hierarchies, and perhaps also with a kind of intersectionality, though we didn't call it that. Loitering, as you know, is something that's seen as lower class, as something that is debased or something that people shouldn't do. And we began seeing how it might challenge ideas of neoliberalism that demanded that everybody be constantly productive. And we were doing this research in the very early 2000s and writing this book roughly between 2007 and 2010. We also saw feminist loitering as something that challenged norms of femininity, sort of the idea of how women should present themselves by the very act of being in public and being in public doing nothing. Because one of the things we realized very early is that women could be in public if they had purpose. So just the idea of being in public doing nothing sort of unsettled notions of how women ought to behave. The other thing that made loitering potentially feminist and also potentially sort of very connected to the idea of citizenship is the fact that loitering is an embodied practice, right? It involves being in the city in a sense, in the way that the Soto talks about, of writing the city with your body, of being very much part of the ways in which practices of the city are inscribed. Um, the last thing I want to say in regard to how we might see it as a transformative practice is building on the work of philosopher Iris Marion Young, who talks about city life and difference, and this idea that really what one should aspire to in relation to cities is not so much communitarian ideals, which Young argues are exclusionary by their very nature, but in fact, really a tolerance for difference, a recognition that different people have equal rights to the city. And I think that this is really, really important today when fault lines are being constantly drawn, when boundaries are constantly being drawn. And really one of the things that has truly made it transformative is the fact that young women have just been loitering.
Interesting. You said that, and you also mentioned Michel de Certeau and his very influential work. Being in public spaces, doing nothing, means that you want to be seen, and you wanted to be recognized and observed that you're not being productive or not conforming to the kinds of gendered mobilities that are encouraged right now, because they are productive and they perfectly fit in the neoliberal setup. So if you want to be seen and observed doing nothing, that's a performative act then. How do you do that? How did you do that before the pandemic? And do you remember the last time you were productively being non-productive in public space and loitering?
When I have to say that when we conceptualized the idea of loitering, we didn't really get, or we didn't really think about how it might work in practice. For us, it was to begin with, a radical utopian way to imagine the city. And when we were asked, and we were asked often soon after we wrote the book, how we were going to operationalize it, we would often draw a blank. It was an idea for an imagined city based on the concepts of the right to citizenship, but we hadn't really, to be honest, thought about what loitering would look like in actual terms, even though we drew these amazing images in the book, about different kinds of groups of people loitering and how women would be discussing different themes. It really was, in a sense, a utopian world that we were imagining. And even as the idea itself is deeply transformative in that it seeks to demolish all kinds of hierarchies, sees women as citizens in relation to structures and institutions of power rather than just in relation to men, right? Challenging the binary understandings of how patriarchy operates. And we were in many, many ways engaging not just patriarchy, but also neoliberalism, religious fundamentalism, and a very, very pernicious anti-poor ideology. And when we conceptualize this idea of loitering as embodied acts that have subversive, radical potential, I have to say, in many ways, we weren't actually thinking of what it would look like. And we only began to realize what it would look like when a theater artist, Neha Singh, began the Why Loiter movement in 2014. And one of the things she told me when we were in conversation was that while she sees the value in large collective take back the night protests, for her it's been the repetitive act of loitering by herself and in small groups that has transformed her relationship with both her body and the city. And in many ways, this practice, this idea of, and they were loitering almost every weekend, in a sense is both and to respond to the question directly, it's both in many ways protest and performance, because it is an act of protest in that it seeks to undermine established structures of power, and it does so in an embodied way. And it's also simultaneously performance in that it is not, it's a um, it's a thoughtful, pre-planned, intentional act, and that renders it performative, if you like. There's a scholar by the name of K. Francis Lader, who wrote an essay, who did ethnography with the Y Loiter group, and she wrote a really, really exciting essay called Performing Loitering, Feminist Protest in the Indian City, where she argues that the fact that if we are able to think of loitering as performance, we will be able to see it outside individualized claims to public space. And this, in fact, she argues, is what lends it its edge and its valency. There's also, as many of you will know, another organization called Blank Noise. And some years ago, they ran a project called Akeli Avara Azad, that is sort of looking at individual women wandering alone and free, which also speaks to the idea of both protest, but they also asked women to write about it. They asked women to take photographs, and they ran these online. And so that also, in a sense, had an element of performance, if you like.
It was really interesting for me to see, and I remember many photos. You were wearing T-shirts, you were participating in different loitering events and happenings. So although you did not anticipate or imagine all these practices that would emerge from the book, you were in conversation with the collectives and you participated in the events. So which ones did you particularly like? Are there any loitering events that you really have a very strong memory of? And can you explain how it perhaps changed your own perception of this bodily experience in public space in the city?
Thanks. That's a great question. So I think more than just participating in these, one of the ways in which we came to loitering was really from our own histories, right? When we began to one engaged the city much more when one was a college student, and as an undergraduate, one sort of learned both the city and oneself at the same time, right? The city was, for me, central to my becoming the person I wanted to be. The city was central to my discovery of myself. And I think that those acts of just being out in public space, and I remember as young college students, we would often sort of hang around on Marine Drive. My college was in South Bombay, and we'd sort of hang around on this promenade along the bay called Marine Drive. And we'd be there really at all hours of the day and night. And sometimes we'd be doing some festival related work in college and we'd miss the last train home. And then 5 or 6 of us would hang out on Marine Drive all night. And it felt incredible just to be there, to know that you could be there, and to feel really very comfortable in oneself and and in one's own skin. I was never alone in these jaunts. We were always 4 or 5 or sometimes 8 or 10 of us. And something that has changed, and this was in the 1990s, but by the time we were researching this project already, and certainly now, the police don't let people hang around in these places after about 12 or 12:30 at night. So around midnight or latest 1 a.m., the police start sort of gathering people and saying, now you should leave from here because it's not safe. But in fact, the fact that there were lots of people hanging around, and we were not the only people hanging around there all night, made it really, really comfortable, even safe in many ways. I have actually participated with the Y Loiter gang in some protests, and that's been in some performances of loitering, and that's been fun because they actually build this performance. They play games in public. They curate what they are doing, and that's been really exciting. It's been exciting also to sort of see what the book has spawned. But I think that many women, many people, really men as well, and people of fluid genders as well, probably share this experience of seeing the city as central to one's engagement with the world and oneself. I'm not sure that answers your question, but yeah.
it does. And I mean, there are a number of questions that I have in mind, and maybe because you talked about the individual experience, but also how it necessarily has to be a collective act, or how you have to establish that sense and notion of collectiveness. This is something that I would like to hear more about. And you also mentioned you called it an embodied practice. So part of this embodied practice and the necessity of being seen doing and performing loitering, acts of loitering, means that you at the same time have to think about how you're going to remediate these acts of loitering. So while preparing it, you have to think about very good images or short videos that you can upload and share, and how this very local experience can turn into something that is experienced and shared by translocal audiences as well, in order to establish that connectivity. So were you aware of, when you wrote the book and when you started to join the loitering collectives, were you aware of this being also about changing media practices and the impact this would have perhaps on media or mediatized communication in India?
Wow, that's an amazing question, and really very, very thoughtful, and I think pushes one to think in many, many directions. To first respond to your question of the collective, and one of the things that women's claims to public space, whether it's the Why Loiter movement or Blank Noise, Girls at Dhabas, one of the things that they've been accused of is of being part of neoliberal individualistic claims. And my response to that really is that practices of loitering are really anything but neoliberal, because the neoliberal order imagines cities and city spaces really as orderly and in many ways as devoid of people. And loitering is fundamentally messy. It's about claiming the city as embodied practice. It's about being there in ways that are not definable. And simultaneously, one of the things that stops it from being neoliberal is that even as people might loiter individually, the practice is not imagined as a single loitering person, but as multiple people loitering either singly or in groups, right? So loitering, when performed as resistance, is fundamentally about the power of collective claiming of citizenship. It is not linked to neoliberal individualistic agendas of consumption, but rather to ideas of publicness. And as you said, that it's an embodied practice, which is, when it's seen as protest, it's fundamentally located in the idea of being seen, in the idea of being seen as doing something. And it's both the idea of being seen as doing something, but it's also the idea of doing it for oneself, even if one is not seen. And fundamentally, loitering must be imagined as collective, not necessarily along with someone. That is not that 2 people or 4 people or 8 people need to loiter on their own, but in terms of imagining it as a multiplicity, right? Loitering only gains when there are several different individuals or groups who are loitering, and it's always imagined in community with others, because it is a practice of claiming citizenship, and one doesn't claim citizenship in this feminist humanitarian way for oneself, but rather with groups of others, including, as we've argued in the book, with groups that are seen to be perhaps unfriendly to women. Mm-hmm. One of the ways in which it's been tied to neoliberal practices is this idea of the new publics, right? The new consuming publics. But the very idea of loitering is antithetical to consumption, right? It challenges the idea that we must be consuming something, that we must be producing something. It is fundamentally a practice of doing nothing. And in this doing nothing, so there is a contradiction in there, right? That we're arguing it's a practice of doing nothing, but we are hoping that it's also both, that it also acts as a form of protest, which is of course not doing nothing. And when it's imagined as performative, it's this act of, again, and I am tying myself up a bit in knots here, but it is imagined as performative, a performative act of doing nothing, so that we might imagine a world in which many people could actually be doing nothing, and where it ceases to be a performance because there are so big, and simply becomes part of literally the everyday practices of life, in a sense. To respond to your second, and I think very perceptive question, the one around media practice and how, and some of these I would say, certainly Blank Noise and the girls at Dabas are practices that, and Blank Noise of course is an artistic practice linked to performance, linked to installation, and the girls at Dabas actually began as a Tumblr account. And these young people, I think much more than us, understood very clearly that this is a dual performance. It's taking place on the street in an embodied self, but it's also taking place elsewhere. It's also taking place in a mediatized world, and that renders it, as you put it, translocal, right? It's a practice that then travels, and we sort of read this in the work of others, and in 2014 we ran a campaign online, which was called hashtag Why Loiter, where we invited women from across South Asia and the world, really, to post images of themselves having fun in their cities. That was it. So it didn't demand that you were feminist. It didn't demand that you had a politics. All it said was, let's share images of ourselves enjoying our cities. And I mean, this is something we just put out without really understanding what kind of response we would get. And the response was tremendous. We were spending hours, upwards of 6 hours a day online, just resharing these images on our own social media handles. And it was clear that this request had hit a chord with so many people. And I think since sort of Blank Noise and Girls at Dabas have been fundamentally practicing both offline and online, another thing they've been doing, and my colleague Nethila Kanagasabai and I did a short research paper looking at the ways in which groups like the Girls at Dabas, Blank Noise, Pinjra Tod, and a more local organization in Mumbai called Parcham were engaged in building an online media community, and the ways in which feminist communities were built. And one sort of anecdote, I'm talking a lot, but I'll stop in a minute. One interesting story that we heard from the girls at Dabas was, they said that they had this social media account, and people would often ask them to explain things. They would ask them questions, and they said there was one point at which somebody, a member of their community, posed a question, and before they could answer it, the Girls at Dabas group, another member of the community responded. And that's the moment at which they felt that this was an idea that was much larger than this group of them that was running this account, if you like.
And you imagine this as a collective performance, experience, and movement. This does not necessarily mean that you need large numbers or bodies in alliance, to quote Judith Butler from her 2011 essay. Nevertheless, I think you expect a lot from people when you would like them to see that that the performative practice is a protest practice, because one, we have the idea of protest being about large numbers of bodies in public spaces, and also there may be a tension, or it is difficult to simultaneously see, because it's a performative practice that claims an everydayness, as if it was nothing special to hang out in public spaces, drink tea and do nothing, to hang around. So you want this to be recognized as being a performative act. You pretend that this could be an everyday act, which then wouldn't be unusual or so exceptional any longer. But this is certainly not the case right now. At the same time, protests, or the protest images and practices that many of us may have in mind, are about extraordinary events, and also extraordinary experiences in our own biographies. So probably many of us don't experience them as being something that you do on an everyday basis. So I think that's really complicated and difficult for somebody who observes these performative, maybe individual acts of loitering, and to know and to learn, okay, and to recognize, yeah, no, this is actually a protest practice, but different from other kinds of protests that we normally see, and that also have come back in a way, because we've seen large protest movements in recent years with large numbers of women. So maybe we can think of it as a continuum, and you have performative practices, and you also have the established protest practices, and there's no mutual exclusion or contradiction. That makes a lot of sense to me, but I guess it's difficult to see and recognize that as an outsider.
Yeah, I think that's very, very well put. I couldn't agree with you more, except that I would just sort of qualify and say that loitering, particularly loitering as performance, is something that we've come to from the actual practices of the Why Loiter movement and the girls at Davos. So it's not something that we imagined. I think it's something that grew out of the book. And I think that that's what makes it so exciting, the collaborative dimension of the ways in which the idea has grown. That in many ways, I feel like the people who read the book and did something politically with it, took it in directions, really, really exciting directions that make really the vision of a loitering future for us all deeply, deeply collaborative. And separately, to add to what you're saying in terms of the ways, the kinds of more recognizable protests that we've seen. We saw in India at the end of 2019 and early 2020, very, very wide-scale protests against the Citizenship Amendment Act of 2019. And many of these were led by women. And I really feel, or I read this in many ways, because of college students forming a cordon between the police and men, college students sort of defending their fellow students, sort of men students, women students defending men students. And I really see a continuum between women's claims to public space in the 21st century and this very, very public claiming of actual citizenship, right? Loitering is an embodied claim of public space and through that citizenship. But here really women are sitting there claiming citizenship for everybody. And I felt that that was so, so powerful, that we found ourselves at this moment where you had women-led protests, and there were not just university students, there were sort of old women who were leading protests, old Muslim women, and a lot of the leaders of these were Dalit women, Muslim women, and young women, you know, I mean, much more, I think, young women than middle-aged women, and some, I mean, we also saw some old women in these protests, and more recently in the farmers' protests we are seeing in India. There's a huge anxiety attached to them. When one court case was being heard, the then Chief Justice of India asked why women and old people are being kept in these protests. You know, so there's a huge anxiety, I think, about women being in public. And I think for us, that's a huge victory. The fact that there is a fear because there's a recognition of the potential for radical change that women have here.
Maybe, I mean, 10 years ago, when there was an incident of massive sexualized violence happening in Delhi, which is referred to as the Nirbhaya case in India, but better known outside of India as the so-called Delhi gang rape case. There were large-scale protests. It was a cold winter. Many students were protesting. The protest started in Delhi, but there were many protests all over India, I think. And there was disproportionate. They were faced with disproportionate police violence. So it was a very severe reaction to an essentially peaceful protest. A very negative, frustrating experience for many young people in India. And I remember there was a lot of support by families, parents, to a certain extent also by the media. But I remember how young participants spoke about this experience of violence, about not being able to change anything through protest as we know it. So this motivated some students to experiment with other forms and practices. And this is interestingly, this is one of the motivations and reasons why they thought, okay, if protests cannot change anything, we should try something new. And this is how, for some, loitering became even more interesting and appealing also. But what we're seeing now is that obviously there's somehow a return, a going back to the idea that you need wide-scale protests and that you need perhaps both. But I still see a difference in the ways performative practices and established protest practices are carried out. And very often, although they happen in urban places, public urban spaces, they're not always directed at the city or how you want it to change. Whereas loitering, the act of loitering always has the city as it should be in mind, right? So that's also an interesting change. So maybe if you would like to talk a bit more about whether you see these changes or if that's just maybe a wrong perception that I have.
I'm trying to think. It's not, I think, one or the other. I think I don't think that I think there are multiple ways we can see it. Like you said, I think that it's not really an either or question. But going back to this, I mean, it's not as if this didn't yield the 2012 protests sort of led to a change in the law, right? We had an Amendment Act in 2013 as a result. I mean, and part of it came out of these protests, and there was the appointment of a commission under Justice Verma that sort of evaluated this and suggested changes, and we had a change in the rape laws in India. So certainly something did come out of that protest. I think one of the things that one has to be a bit cautious about, and I'm trying to choose my words with care here, is that there's a huge there's always two things here, that certain kinds of violence, that is sexual violence, often produces a lot of protest, that there's a lot of anxiety around women's virtue, around honor, family and community honor, and that produces huge protests around sexual violence. And one needs to be a bit cautious about while these are important, and certainly one must participate in them, and they're really important to change, we need to also ask questions about why there aren't protests about the rising unemployment, and not just in India, but globally, the rising rate of sort of unemployment for women, the lowering numbers of women in employment in this country. So that's one. And the second thing about protest, though this is not really what you're asking, I realize, is that certain kinds of sexual violence, particularly those against women who are perceived to be middle class or upper caste or Hindu, you see much more media coverage, you see much more protests than when the victims are poor or Muslim or Dalit. And I think this is something that we need to take cognizance of. We do need to recognize that protests themselves are embedded in various kinds of sort of structures of hierarchy, of class, of caste, of religion. And we do need to take cognizance of these.
Yeah. When I'm thinking of Pinjrator, they actually do both. They have performative practices, they have protest practices, they have experimented with lots of practices, I think. So that really makes a lot of sense to me. Interestingly, when you mentioned the farmers' protests, I was thinking of a conversation that my colleague Fritzi Tietzmann held with Ranade, who's a very, very prominent and interesting activist. Also, yeah, is part of or is co-editor of a newsletter, new newspaper. And she mentioned in this conversation that somehow what the protesters brought to Delhi was the idea of how a good city could be, what it could be like. So during the protest, they created also a performative practice of this is what actually good neighborhood relations, really in a very positive sense, sharing the little space that you have, the little resources that you have, making the most of it. And I really like this idea because I think that also you need protest spaces, and you still need this idea of this being extraordinary and not every day in order to imagine and rethink the city, what it could be like. How did you perceive this, or did you see this idea of, yeah, this is actually, if we still had enough space, and if space was not shrinking, and if there was not so much surveillance and control of our movements, and also increasingly again of our minds, probably, this utopian city life, what it could be like. Did you see that in the farmers' protests?
So the farmers' protests have been incredible in many ways, and exactly as sort of you're recounting, for the ways in which they've made that their practices have brought home the ways in which one truly sort of reimagines spaces and worlds. Responding to your earlier sort of comment on the Pinjratod, for instance, which I think has been doing really incredible work, and they were deeply involved in the protests, and two of the members of Pinjratod, in fact, were in jail for over a year. They're just out on bail now. They've been engaged in practices looking at women's access to the city, but also attempting very deeply to build intersectional connections with other movements. But there's also been a writing back to Pinjratod by Dalit, Adivasi, and Muslim women within the movement, who say that they felt somehow excluded from the movement. So I think that all of these movements that we engage with are movements that we need to think about, that are complex, that are layered, and are constantly in a process of evolving. I think Pinjratod took that on, and they thought about it, and they also wrote a report responding to the kind of sort of comments that were made about them. But Yeah, I mean, I don't have very much to add to your assessment and the sort of recounting of the farmers' movement, which has and continues to be really, really inspirational, just not just for the way in which they've held their ground, but the ways in which, as you pointed out, they've just built a practice and really demonstrated that another world is possible.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. When you mention intersectionality and also when you talk about caste, you said in the beginning that you did not really use the term intersectionality when the three of you wrote the book. And there has also been an interesting debate among feminist scholars in India if it is really useful to use the concept in Indian or South Asian contexts, where you probably always, as scholars, definitely have an intersectional perspective. So in the book, Loiter, while you talk about caste-based discrimination and violence against less privileged and marginalized caste groups, perhaps the central focus is on class and gender in the city. So this is perhaps the center of the intersectional analytical perspective of the book. And as you explain also in detail in the book, on the one hand, Mumbai has been perceived or somehow continues to perceived as a more women-friendly city compared to cities like Delhi, for example. And the second image is that when you migrate and come to the city, you leave caste behind, and it's not about caste, not centrally any longer. So there was this idea that caste belongs more to less urbanized or rural contexts and not to a city like Mumbai. And I think this is something which has been critiqued and debated, and perhaps there's a new way of looking at caste and class in the city, but also gender and caste. So is this something that the three of you, and also in your conversations with the collectives, that you debate at the moment and discuss, and if so, how? How do you look at this?
I think that the caste has been a blind spot of the book in many ways. We went in, as you pointed out, with very much a class perspective on how the city looked like. And religion was something that came up over and over again. So we ended up really engaging with the question of Muslim men, of the ways in which the city was deeply fractured along religious lines, because it kept coming up. Caste, even when we asked, is something that people chose not to engage. And so, I mean, partly it was our blind spot, but partly it was, even when we brought it up, it's something that people chose to elide or not talk about. And so it didn't come up in quite the same way. Having said that, I think the discussion on caste has become far more central after our book was published than it was between 2027 and 2010, when we were writing the book. I think that debate has become far more central. And surely, if we were writing that book today, we would find it much that one would engage far more centrally with caste than we did then. Having said that, I think one of the things we found is that groups of people, particularly that we engaged with in the book, so whether it's disabled women or lesbian women, another group that we didn't really engage with is trans women. We engaged with lesbian women, but the trans debate also has grown tremendously in the last decade. And that's something one might have engaged with far more had one been writing the book today, or if one was thinking of those ideas. And I think the nice thing is that people are, I mean, you know, the scholarship on public space has grown tremendously since we wrote our book, you know, on gendered public space. And there's work now on caste, on trans people, and certainly, I mean, the book was only the beginning, I think, of a conversation on loitering, on the public, and certainly, I mean, I will acknowledge very openly that it comes up short when we talk of caste, and those are narratives that are coming up, and And, I mean, I think they're really, really central and important. And I think they are, as you pointed out, sort of the narrative that we leave caste behind when we reach the city is one that has been completely debunked today. That caste is very, very much present, and one learns every day.
Yeah. So you acknowledge and the differences, and you are fully aware that it's, I mean, on the one hand, not possible to talk about women's experiences irrespective of caste, class, religion, and many gender, sexuality, sexual identity, sorry. Nevertheless, in a recently held conversation on the occasion of the 10th anniversary of your book, you argue, drawing on Spivak, you argue for a strategic essentialism, because you feel that, as you said in that conversation, you feel that the current situation requires this collective response. And I would like you to expand on this perceived notion or idea that it's necessary and it would be more difficult or not possible to, for example, establish or try to create an alliance that does not exclude or that can actually centrally acknowledge the idea of difference and nevertheless become a very strong alliance. Could you elaborate on the strategic essentialism that you argued for?
Okay, I'm going to try, despite the fact that I will most likely tie myself up in knots while I do it. So it's a difficult question, I think. And for instance, let me speak to the anti-CAA protest, for instance, that the anti-CAA protest involved different groups of people. But there was a kind of coordination. People were talking to each other, people were discussing strategies and practices, and there was a specific goal. There was a goal to challenge and to overturn the Citizenship Amendment Act. There was a goal to prevent the National Population Register from taking place, this registry that demanded that all citizens queue up and produce papers. And there was this claim saying, "Hum kagaj nahi dikhayenge," this idea that we will not show you our papers. Now, clearly, all of the people in this movement are not located in the same place. We're all, and that there are huge differences, huge disagreements, and huge differences in privilege, in access to resources. But there is a moment at which there's a law that needs to be challenged. And I think that perhaps that's the kind of space in which I would like to argue that we do need a strategic essentialism, that we do need to see that we're needed to come together as a collective, so long as we never forget that we are not a homogeneous collective, that we are not a flat collective, that there are movements, and that even within these protests, when people get picked up, when people get beaten up, that there is a hierarchy even there. To recognize that we are differentially located within the power structures as well, and to try and think of ways in which we might be able to address this. So I think that both those conversations need to happen simultaneously. The conversation about the larger cause and the cause that unites us all, but simultaneously to not say, and this is, I think, really, really difficult, to not say that until that cause is achieved, we can't talk about any other difference, to continuously have this conversation. And at no point am I suggesting that it's easy. I mean, this is the other conversation, parallelly to this has been a conversation on the ways in which sort of men who are our allies, have been accused of sexual harassment, of sexual assault. And then how does one address this question, right? It's not a question that can be put aside for another day. It is a question that we must address today, even as we recognize that there is also common cause with large numbers of people. I think it's this kind of multi-layered, complex thing that requires us to engage and re-engage and never stop thinking about and challenging and to challenge our own our own the kinds of imaginations we hold ourselves, right? To constantly challenge those as well, and to allow ourselves to be challenged by others.
Mm-hmm. But depending on who we are, we loiter differently. And our loitering in public space is also seen differently. So a loitering poor body is faced with very different risks from the kind of risks or what middle-class women might encounter in public space while loitering. So would it be necessary, or do you think there should be more literature about how we loiter differently and what are the commonalities, or have there been some initiatives, some encouragements of other collectives to write about how they see and how they imagine or practice the act of loitering or walking in the city or being non-productive in the city? And whether they share that vision of, this becoming a larger movement.
When we were doing our research, we were asking, our questions were located around access to public space, because loitering was something that we came to as we were analyzing our data. And so our questions were more about, would you like to hang out in public space? Where do you go out to have fun? And one of the things we found was that really loitering had no class. It had no religion. I imagine it has no caste as well. Everybody wants to hang out in public. But what you say is also simultaneously absolutely true, that a middle-class woman loitering has a differential both embodied language because of the ways in which she has accrued cultural capital and also class capital in various ways than a poor woman loitering. A middle-class woman may also have more time to loiter than a poor woman. And so clearly there is a very, very deep class element to this. The hope is that by loitering, by pushing citizenship agendas, we transform public space to some extent for everybody, for middle-class women, for poor women, but also for, and this is the question that Kush Patel also asked, for also gender non-conforming bodies, if you like, right, which are also subject to violence at home and in public space. And so, I mean, and like I said, like caste was one of the blind spots. One of the central themes of central agendas of our book was toilets, right? This idea that the lack of toilets in public space, the lack of open toilets define women's exclusion from public space. And one of the things we never ever mentioned in that is gender neutral toilets. Mm-hmm. It was just not as much in our vocabulary at that time. And I feel like that's a huge blind spot, because that's something we need to be talking about as well. We did say, and we did talk about a narrative which we heard from lesbian women who present as butch, who would say that the spaces in which they faced a great deal of violence were all women's spaces, like women's compartments in local trains or in women's toilets. And so clearly that nuance was there, but it never led us, or we didn't take it to the next stage by talking about gender neutral toilets. And I feel like that's something, and I think that there is work now as there should be. And so clearly these agendas have grown, they've transformed, and it's important.
Are the three of you thinking about writing another book together?
So we thought of rewriting an introduction to the book. And one of the things is that, in a sense, when we began, we said, our book will date. It won't be so relevant after a while. In some ways, it's deeply tragic that 10 years later, if anything, the book is more relevant than it was in 2011. And so we thought, we should write an introduction, rewrite the introduction for 10 years later. But now there's so much has happened, and it's so deeply complex and layered that, in fact, we started writing it and we never finished. I mean, it's an unfinished project. We may do it, we may not. We've collaborated on other things. We've been talking about doing a whole host of things, but yeah, this is something we actually started writing a new introduction to the book, but we never finished it.
Very interesting. I'd love to read it. So yeah, maybe one last question. If we're not too pessimistic about the next couple of years, but dare to dream about a positive change, and if the two of us meet again in 10 years to talk about the book, and 20 years after the book, what would you hope would be some of the most interesting topics that we could talk about?
Well, my hope would be, in some ways, in a sense, the fact that a huge literature has grown around public space has also been really exciting. And my hope would be that that literature expands. But my hope also would be that we could talk about the ways in which our cities have built infrastructure that responds to these concerns. And I think that this is not outside the realm of our imagination. If we imagine that our worlds will be no longer patriarchal or no longer misogynist, I'm not sure that's something one can really imagine. But I think that if we imagine that our cities will have built more infrastructure, more public infrastructure, more transport, more toilets, including gender neutral toilets, that our cities would have reimagined public space in ways that invites people rather than excludes them, rather than closing off parks to open them. I feel like if we could begin to have conversations that 10 years down the line, if we could imagine a different infrastructure in which we work, I think that would be a huge, huge gain. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. It was really a very interesting conversation, and yeah, I hope that you're really going to write the introduction. And actually, I do hope that we'll meet again, maybe a bit earlier than 10 years down the line, but maybe we can have another conversation in 10 years and see what actually has changed or is in the process of changing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. This has been so, so nice. It's always really, really warm and heartening talking with you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Shilpa.
Bye.